thought actually with this building when we started designing twofold. One was to make the building a connector, because this site was very complicated and very desolated, as you know. So it was just a parking ground with a big heavy traffic road going over it. Nobody ever wanted to come here because it was basically not very pleasant. So the first idea was, of course, if we're going to invest in this site, we better make it to work and make it a place where people want to go. And the second thought was, of course, thinking about DAC as an architectural center, how it should be positioned in a multi-use program. Because of course we have housing here, offices, parking, you know, all kinds of programs that you normally expect in a city. And normally, you know, you see if an architect is asked to design a building like this, then you see that the public function is normally on the ground floor, and then you get the offices and then you get the housing on top. But of course we were quite interested in mix that all up. So we actually put DAC not just on the ground floor basically, but just in the center of the whole thing. So that DAC would be embedded in its own field of study, because they study the future of office, they study the future of parking, they study the future of housing. So that was the whole idea, you know, that DAC would be in the center and then would actually contaminate all the other functions. And this is a word I was never allowed to use in Denmark because it was not politically correct. But I always said it was a kind of architectural word, you know, architectural contamination, which is an interesting idea. That, you know, the users that are in the building can use each other's space. And then you can actually change the building at any time. Yeah, well, the first idea was, of course, to do something cubic, because, of course, we had this kind of diagram in the beginning of what is for us as foreigners the representation of Danish architecture. So we represented Danish architecture as being a box with a front door in it. But the program we wanted to realize here was actually quite large. So we spent a lot of time in trying to keep the building as small as we could. And also by, let's say, correcting the volume on each side by taking out pixels out of the cubic volume. We were, I think, able to connect to all these different scales around us. And then, of course, the other idea was that you would have, when you're in the building, you would have all these view lines, you know, so you would actually see the context in long access through the building, connecting again all the different sides to this project.
Was it hard to build at a spot where you have kind of air and water on the one hand and kind of very small buildings on the other hand?
Well, of course, the yellow houses, as we call them, are very, very small. So, and of course, we try to connect to that in creating a new urban space, which the yellow houses on one side and the building on the other side, and trying to reduce the scale as much as we could. But for us, what was more important to connect to was actually, you know, the typical blocks that you see here. It's typical, you know, city blocks as you have them in Copenhagen. And of course also the water on that side, because the water, of course, we wanted to connect to the water. And we did one thing to this building, which is normally absolutely forbidden in Copenhagen. We put the building on the water line. And actually it's even cantilevering over. Because, you know, there's this rule in Denmark that you have to keep 6 meters free along all the buildings along the water side. But we considered that extremely boring since you have so much water. So actually we were planning to do something with the building that you would not have the normal relation between the building and the water side, but you actually would need, as soon as you could get close to this building, that you would actually need to go through the building. And that is of all comes back to this idea of urban connector. You can't just go through the building. The building is made in such a way that you do have to interact with the building. And of course, the best function to have interconnected with the people was, of course, the architectural center. So it doesn't matter which route you take, you go through, under, or each side, you have to relate to the building. And you have to build a kind of relationship. I think when we started to design, we had a lot more boxes. It was more like a pile of boxes. And at a certain point, we decided to make it a little bit more rational. So it's like you see a kind of white box, like a white band. That is actually the band where you have the offices in. And then on the top, it gets more like pixelated, like Lego blocks, and on the bottom. And on the top, that was actually quite a good concept, because for the housing, we had this idea of making row houses, but then up in the air. So we had this idea of making, apartments with enormous terraces, so you actually would have a garden in the sky instead of just an apartment. And on the bottom, it worked quite well, because by pixelating the public area where people encounter the building first, you can create areas where people really feel you should go in, dive, interact, etc. You create cantilevers, so it will look on all sides very different. And then, of course, on the side to the real monuments, the governmental islands, there, of course, we had some discussions with some people in Copenhagen, because, of course, they considered this building far too modern and far too massive in relation to the historical island. So, and there we had a kind of interaction with heritage to see how we can basically make the building lighter on that side, so that the historical monuments, which are mostly boxes, would still, basically exist in their existing form. That was our take on it, but of course, as you know, we had quite some discussions on that, and some of these discussions I considered a bit weird. Yeah, it's architecture, but of course the main purpose of building a design and architecture center is not showing off your own architecture, it's showing off other types of architecture. I think that's where it comes down to. So I think we had to think about, of course, on one hand we wanted to be the architectural statement in first instance from our side, but that's not the main purpose. The main purpose of the center is, of course, that it is a good space where you can basically explain architecture to the visitors to this building, and that is actually the main purpose. Because the DAC, if we only look at the DAC spaces inside the building, of course we designed DAC spatially as a kind of octopus. So when you are on different levels of DAC, you have views outside. So it starts in the center of the building, but then on every level it tries to push itself outside. So it creates relationships with its environment. And by doing so, I think we were able to create a huge diversity of spaces, which can all be used for tons of different functions. So you can imagine we have in total 2 exhibition spaces, and of course we have also an auditorium, but the auditorium can also be an exhibition space. The exhibition space can be an auditorium. And the main exhibition space, which is officially called an exhibition space, is for me also an event space, so there is of course much more to it. That I think that makes it our main building. It is multifunctional. I think it will stimulate them thinking about doing things they are not used to, and at the same time you can also use it as a more traditional thing. Of course, we had a lot of discussions with DAC, and we started actually with DAC doing a study with what their future would be in general. Because I think in the old building where they were in, architecture was, let's say, exhibited in a very traditional way. And architecture is very difficult to exhibit, because it's quite often a quite difficult thing to exhibit, because it doesn't appeal to many people. Quite often you see they exhibit black and white drawings and boring black and white models, so it really doesn't, especially to non-architects, it doesn't really give you this feel of, you know, what the architecture in its life would be. And I think what we tried in this building, and that we had also on that many discussions with DAC, that this building should not only be a building where we only show, you know, drawings and small models, but we should really try to show architecture, first of all, in a much larger scale. So that's the reason why we basically made much higher spaces. You see, all the ceilings are designed more or less as if you're in a warehouse. So we are looking forward in hanging things from the ceiling and not having this kind of 2D experience. And also, you know, thinking about scale. It would be great to have models which are much larger than normal, so that people who visit the Architectural Center, when they look in models, they can imagine much more what it would be in the building. And of course, and the other idea was also to connect other art forms to the museum. So we made what we call the National Indemnity Space. That was one of the program requires. We made it the Golden Room, because it's actually the most secured room in the whole building. And the idea in that room is also to connect art, you know, art, spatial experience to architecture. So I think it was the right task for us, this site, because nobody really knew what to do with it. And I think the fact it was the right task for us, to do. And it had to do with reinventing mixed use, reinventing DAC, and reinventing also this area of Copenhagen. So I think in that sense, I think it was a good task. My dream is that it's full with people, that we have always a kind of public program that drags people to this building. And the other thing I'm looking forward to is that people interact with each other. So I'm very curious to see how office users are interacting with the museum, you know, how the people who live in this building interact with the office users and with the museum. The dream was really a mixing chamber to the max. Because there's quite a lot of users in this building are creative users. So I really hope that there are moments where fashion is connected to cities, you know, where cities are connected to furniture, to design, to filming, etc. And I hope out of that it could give a new boost to the creative industry in Denmark.